quise entender algo complicado.
Good evening and welcome everyone to Human and Environmental Justice in Guatemala. It's great to see so many of you here on this wintry evening. I'm Professor Candace Johnson of the Department of Political Science at the University of Guelph, and I have organized this event with my colleague Stephen Hennigan, who's a professor in the School of Languages and Literatures. I'd like to recognize just a few people to begin with and mention the various institutes and initiatives on campus that have sponsored the event tonight. Is this better?
No, close to your mouth.
Like this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Did you all hear all of that, more or less? Okay. I'd like to recognize the support and great work of Catherine Badham from International Development Studies and Lorena Leija, who is the coordinator and facilitator for the Institute for Community Engaged Scholarship. The event is sponsored by the Institute for Community Engaged Scholarship, so I'd like to recognize the great support of the director, Linda Hawkins. Also sponsored by the Initiatives on Global Justice. There I'd like to acknowledge the support of Canada Research Chair and Professor of Philosophy Monique DeVoe. As well, the event is sponsored by and supported by International Development Studies, and here I'd like to recognize Professor Sally Humphreys, who is here in the audience as well, and also mention the Department of Political Science and the School of Languages and Literatures. I'm delighted and fortunate to have three fantastic guests here for tonight's panel. Dr. Claudia Paz Bailey, Magali Rosa, and Dr. Kirsten Weld. I'll be giving more by way of introduction in just a few moments. The format for tonight's event is going to be as follows. Each of our guests will speak for about 25 minutes, and then after all of them have given their presentations, they'll have the opportunity to comment on each other's presentations, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and discussion. While I am talking, I'm also going to very quickly mention two other events that are part of this two-day event on human and environmental justice in Guatemala. Tomorrow, Dr. Kristen Wells is going to be speaking in the Political Science Department Speakers Series. She'll be talking, giving a talk from 11:30 to 1:30 on the campus of the University of Guelph in the Hut Building, number 234. And the title of this talk is The Justice Offensive, Guatemala's Human Rights Trials and War by Other Means. As well, tomorrow evening on the University of Guelph campus at 7 p.m. there's a screening of Gold Fever in Rosansky Hall 105, and there'll be commentary by Magali Rosa and Graham Russell of Rights Action. Okay, so I would like to introduce to you now Dr. Claudia Paz Bailey, and the title of her talk tonight is going to be Justicia en Guatemala. Guatemala's first female Attorney General, Dr. Claudia Paz Bailey, is a criminal law specialist, scholar, judge, and litigator who has worked for over 18 years to strengthen the justice system in her country, Guatemala. She earned her doctorate in human rights and criminal law, served as a judge, and was a national consultant to the UN mission in Guatemala. In 1994, she founded the Institute for Comparative Criminal Studies of Guatemala, a human rights organization that promotes restorative justice and protects the rights of marginalized and discriminated groups during criminal proceedings. Dr. Paz Bailey assumed leadership of Guatemala's Ministerio Público, the prosecutor's office, in December 2010 until May 2014, and pursued cases against both the organized criminals of today and the perpetrators of massive human rights abuses in the past. She is currently at Georgetown University for 1 year as a distinguished scholar in residence, with a joint appointment between GIWPS, I didn't ask what that acronym is, anyway, we can find out later, and the Georgetown University Law Center. So welcome, Doctora Paz Bailey. Yes, I will also mention, and I'll stop talking for a very long time, I promise, her talk is going to be translated by Professor Stephen Hennigan.
Muy buenas noches a todas y todos. En primer lugar, mi agradecimiento a la Universidad de Yale por la invitación, por darnos la oportunidad de estar acá, de compartir con tan distinguidas panelistas. Creo que va a ser un panel diverso y muy entretenido.
So thank you very much for the invitation and for making it possible for me to be here, and I look forward to a very lively and entertaining panel.
Muchas gracias también a todos ustedes por venir. Yo sé que en Canadá es bastante normal, pero para los que venimos de un poco más al sur, hace frío, y sobre todo a mis compatriotas guatemaltecos, que sé que hay varios que nos acompañan esta noche.
And I know that it's normal to have weather like this in Canada, but for us, from a little further south, it's not so normal, and for that reason I'm very pleased to see some of my Guatemalan compañeros accompanying me here tonight.
Como muchos de ustedes saben, Guatemala vivió una guerra que duró más de 3 décadas, finalizó en 1996 con la firma de la paz. Fue una guerra en la que se cometieron graves y masivas violaciones a los derechos humanos. La Comisión para el Esclarecimiento Histórico o Comisión de la Verdad de Guatemala documentó directamente más de 42,000 víctimas de ejecuciones extrajudiciales, de desaparición forzada, de tortura, de violencia y violación sexual.
Guatemala, as you may know, had suffered a civil war of more than 3 decades, which ended in 1996 with the signing of the peace accords. The Commission for Historical Illumination, I suppose, and for the Truth registered a total of 42,775 victims, including women, children, and men, and more than 24,000 were victims of arbitrary executions and 6,000 victims of forced disappearance.
Es importante mencionar que de las víctimas plenamente identificadas, 83% eran integrantes del pueblo maya, eran mayas, y 17% eran ladinos. Combinando estos datos con otros estudios realizados sobre violencia política en Guatemala, la comisión estableció que hubo un saldo entre muertos y desaparecidos del enfrentamiento que llegó a más de 200,000 personas. Y la comisión también señaló que en un determinado momento de la guerra, entre 1981 y 1983, se cometieron actos de genocidio en contra del pueblo maya.
It's important to mention that about 83% of the victims of the war belonged to the indigenous Mayan ethnicity, and about 17% were identified with the European Guatemalans of European extraction. Putting this information together with other studies that have been done on violence in Guatemala, the Commission for Historical Clarity estimated that the total number of dead and disappeared in the confrontation reached 200,000. The Commission also indicated that between 1981 and 1983, in certain regions of the country, particularly in the Northwest Highlands, acts of genocide occurred.
Una de las grandes apuestas del proceso de paz, de los acuerdos de paz, era la reconstrucción del sistema de justicia en Guatemala, de uno que había encubierto las graves violaciones a los derechos humanos, a uno que garantizara el sistema de justicia para todos los guatemaltecos y guatemaltecas. En más o menos 10 años se construyó el Ministerio Público, el Instituto de la Defensa Pública Penal, hubo juzgados en varios lugares del país donde antes no había habido acceso a la justicia, y se creó una nueva Policía Nacional Civil.
So one of the challenges of the peace process was to the reconstruction of the country's judicial system from one which had covered up serious violations of human rights to a system that would actually protect individuals and guarantee them access to justice. In the Global Human Rights Agreement, I'm sorry? Okay. There was an attempt to combat impunity, that is, people being able to go for years without being punished for their crimes. And in order to do all of this, Guatemala created various new institutions after 1996, including a public ministry or a sort of ministry of justice, a new national civil police force, and a civil defense organization. Also justices of the peace and trial courts in regional centers.
10 años después, sin embargo, 10 años después de la firma de la paz, estábamos aún muy lejos de alcanzar, de garantizar el acceso de justicia para todos. Por un lado, existían altísimos índices de impunidad, la mayoría de casos, pero especialmente los casos más violentos, homicidios, asesinatos, violencia contra las mujeres permanecían en la impunidad y correlativamente, al igual que en otros países de la región centroamericana, las tasas de homicidio aumentaban cada vez más. Llegamos a la tasa más alta en Guatemala, que fue 46 homicidios por cada 100,000 habitantes en el año 2009.
In spite of these efforts, 10 years after the signing of the peace accords, it was evident that the country was far from guaranteeing justice for all. On the one hand, there were high levels of impunity, people who had committed crimes and were not being tried for them, and this was especially true of the most violent and gross human rights offenders. On the other hand, regular, ordinary homicide had risen enormously, and which also happened in some of the surrounding countries, and by 2007 it had reached 46 people per 100,000, which is fifth or sixth highest rate in the world, I believe.
Los hechos creo que ilustran bastante el clima de violencia que se vivía en Guatemala. Uno fue el asesinato en la cárcel de Pavan de 7 reclusos. El asesinato fue por miembros de las fuerzas de seguridad, de la policía. Por este hecho ya fue condenado en Suiza el entonces director de la Policía Nacional Civil, y el ministro de Gobernación se encuentra esperando proceso en España. Es decir, que fueron crímenes cometidos por altas autoridades del Estado. Y el segundo fue el asesinato de 3 parlamentarios salvadoreños y su piloto en febrero del año 2007 por miembros de la Policía Nacional Civil, quienes fueron posteriormente asesinados también a su vez en el interior de una de las cárceles de máxima seguridad en Guatemala.
2 incidents that indicate this climate of impunity and violence in Guatemala were in one case what's called the Pavan jail attack, where 7 prisoners were killed inside a high security jail, and the then director of the National Prison Service has actually been condemned in Switzerland for this, and is in the then Minister of Justice is now also facing trial in Spain. Another case is the assassination of 3 members of the Salvadorian Parliament and their driver, who were killed by members of the police force, who were later assassinated in jail.
Estos hechos ilustran no solo el descreimiento y desconfianza que existía frente a las autoridades de seguridad y de justicia, demuestran también el involucramiento de autoridades de seguridad y justicia en acciones criminales, Algo muy preocupante que ocurrió en Guatemala es que frente a tanta violencia e inseguridad había como una demanda pública de violencia. Tuvimos alzas en linchamientos, en sicariato, en ejecuciones extrajudiciales y también fuimos testigos de cómo el crimen organizado había infiltrado las instituciones de justicia y seguridad.
So these illustrate the climate which existed in Guatemala at that time. In 2007, 10 years after the peace accords, there was a lack of belief and a lack of confidence in the justice system and in the security, the national authorities involved in security and justice. And they were even involved in criminal activities themselves. There was a demand that they not remain outside the law, and it was clear that organized crime had entered into the highest realms of the security and justice structures of the nation.
Por estas razones, el Estado de Guatemala pidió apoyo a Naciones Unidas y en el año 2007 se instaló en el país la Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad, CICIG. Gracias a la presencia de CICIG en el país, hubo un recambio de las autoridades más importantes del sistema de justicia, hubo un nuevo ministro de Gobernación, nuevas autoridades en la Corte Suprema de Justicia y un nuevo fiscal general. El proceso anterior de la elección del fiscal general fue anulado, hubo un nuevo proceso y en ese momento fue cuando yo resulté electa en diciembre del año 2010.
For these reasons, the government of Guatemala asked for assistance from the United Nations, and in 2007 the International Commission Against Impunity was established in Guatemala. This commission was able to investigate cases and take them to court, and thanks to the presence of this organization in the country, new authorities were named to the Supreme Court, to the Ministry of Justice, and to the Public Ministry. And it was in that moment that Dr. Paz, was elected as Attorney General.
Esto permitió unas sinergias sin precedentes en el país, trabajo coordinado entre policías, fiscales y jueces. Hubo muchos éxitos en el combate al crimen organizado, al narcotráfico. También hubo investigaciones en contra de integrantes de pandillas que llevaban a cabo extorsiones y también se resolvieron casos de violencia contra mujeres. Y especialmente, que es a lo que me voy a referir en un momento, avanzaron casos que tenían muchos años de estar pendientes en el sistema de justicia referentes a graves violaciones a los derechos humanos.
So this synergy of new organizations and new figures in the organizations it created an environment in which it was possible to bring to trial drug dealers, leaders of gangs, and people who had perpetrated violence against women and people who had perpetrated human rights abuses. And it's this latter case, the human rights abuses, the people who had been able to escape justice for 20 years or so, that she will be talking about in a minute.
Las víctimas y sobrevivientes de la guerra nunca dejaron de reclamar justicia en Guatemala. Durante años mantuvieron sus demandas frente al sistema. Las primeras querellas por genocidio se presentaron en los años 2000 y 2001 y hubo también varias sentencias de la Corte Nacional que permitieron el avance de estos casos. Una de ellas, muy importante, fue una sentencia que decía, de la Corte de Constitucionalidad, que los documentos militares no eran documentos secretos, que se podía tener acceso a estos documentos. Esa sentencia, junto con el aparecimiento del archivo de la Policía Nacional, dotó de prueba documental a los distintos juicios.
The people who had suffered human rights abuses, the survivors and the relatives of victims, never stopped demanding that justice from the system. The first lawsuits for genocide and crimes against humanity were presented in the years 2000 and 2001. And alongside this unstoppable demand for justice, various sentences smoothed the way for more serious cases of human rights violations to be judged in the country's constitutional court. And one of these decisions was that the country's constitutional court declared that military documents were not secret documents. And so those which were dealing with cases of forced disappearances had to be considered in court, and this made it possible to prosecute high military officers for genocide. Creo que me adelanté un poco. And yeah, the other issue which Dr. Weld will be addressing is the discovery of the secret police archives, which nobody even knew existed and which suddenly appeared in an abandoned building on the edge of Guatemala City.
El sistema interamericano también emitió varios fallos que ordenaban que el sistema interno removiera todos los obstáculos que de hecho o de derecho impedían que estos casos avanzaran, y paralelamente durante más de 20 años se habían producido exhumaciones. En Guatemala se han exhumado más de 8,000 cuerpos. Estas exhumaciones en cientos de casos se constituirían en la evidencia forense de la ocurrencia de genocidio en el país.
The Inter-American Court had rendered various judgments which had removed obstacles to the factual obstacles and legal obstacles to the bringing these cases to trial. Also, over the last 20 years, numerous exhumations of bodies of victims had been taking place in Guatemala, and these furnished the scientific evidence that could be used to bring cases of genocide. In fact, more than 8,000 bodies had been exhumed by this time.
En enero del año 2013, un juez en Guatemala se atreve a ordenar que el caso en contra del ex jefe de Estado Efraín Cruz Montt fuera a juicio. Y pocos meses después, en marzo, inicia el proceso.
In January 2013, a judge actually dared at last to open a trial against General Rios Montt, one of the most flagrant human rights abusers of the 1980s, for genocide. And this case opened in March. March was the beginning of the trial. Sorry.
El caso era un caso muy sólido, se presentaron más de 100 testigos, más de 40 peritos, como decía hace un momento, se presentó evidencia forense, y quizás el momento más fuerte del juicio, el momento más emotivo, fue cuando tocó el momento a declarar a 10 sobrevivientes de violencia sexual.
The case was very well documented. There were more than 100 witnesses, more than 40 experts were called, military documents were used, forensic evidence, and perhaps the most emotional and wrenching part of the testimony was when the cases of sexual violence were discussed in open court.
Habíamos pedido previamente que el caso, en ese momento, el caso se llevara a puerta cerrada para evitar la revictimización de las sobrevivientes. Muchas no habían contado en su familia o en su comunidad que habían sufrido violencia sexual, así que se dio una gran discusión alrededor, y recuerdo muy bien las palabras de un compañero que dijo: ustedes lo que están hablando aquí sí son más fuertes que nosotros, preguntémosles y que ellas decidan si quieren declarar.
At first it was thought that the trials, this part of the trials dealing with sexual violence, would take place behind closed doors, since in many cases not even the life partners or the family members of the victims were aware of what had happened to them. However, there was a concern not to re-victimize the women who had suffered these aggressions. However, one of the people involved said, "You don't understand the strength of these women," and finally it was decided that they would simply cover their faces with a shawl, and that the first rows of the courtroom would be filled with women who supported them.
Como bien se dijo, ellas eran muy fuertes y dieron su testimonio. Algo cambió a partir de ese día. Había un cerco mediático hacia el juicio. Ese cerco se rompió. Se había tratado de minimizar o de silenciar el caso. Para todos los ciudadanos y ciudadanas que escucharon los relatos de las mujeres, observaron su valor, fue imposible dejar de sentir empatía con ellas. Ellas y otros testigos del juicio que venían desde los lugares más recónditos del país, desde las montañas de Guatemala, llegaron al lugar que simbólicamente es el lugar más importante de la justicia del país, el Salón de Audiencias de la Corte Suprema de Justicia, y ahí, y en su idioma, le dijeron a Efraín Ríos Montt, a quien había ordenado todas estas graves violaciones a los derechos humanos: usted nos hizo eso, esto no es correcto, nosotros somos personas, no somos animales, y él lo tuvo que escuchar en frente de un tribunal.
They gave their testimony out of their strength, and something changed that day, and the media circus that had surrounded the trial broke. The citizens who heard these stories and who witnessed these women relating these stories found it impossible not to empathize with them and to feel some of their suffering. They and other witnesses at the trial, who came from the most remote areas of the country, from the farthest mountains in Guatemala, arrived at the Supreme Court, the center of the state's judicial apparatus, and which was the state that had actually ordered these abuses and violations. And they were able to speak in their own languages, in the Mayan languages, not in Spanish, to General Rios Montt and to tell him, this is what you did to us. This is not correct. We are people, we are not animals.
Y durante el juicio, la justicia tiene ese enorme poder de igualar. Las víctimas se encontraron al mismo nivel de los perpetradores. También, al prestar su testimonio, el juicio permitió que se rompiera el silencio que existía sobre muchas violaciones a los derechos humanos, pero sobre todo existía sobre la violencia sexual. Y el juicio creo que tuvo un enorme poder reparador para las víctimas, porque la culpa que podrían sentir de haber sufrido las violaciones a los derechos humanos por fin salió de sus almas y de su cuerpo y se instaló en los perpetradores, que son los auténticos responsables.
The trial allowed for once that the perpetrator and the victims could meet on a level playing field. The trial also allowed the silence about many of the human rights abuses to be broken, particularly the silence that reigned over questions of sexual abuse and acts of sexual abuse that had occurred. And because of this trial, the idea of fault or blame left the bodies of the women who had suffered, and anchored itself in those who were responsible, the perpetrators.
El Tribunal A de Mayor Riesgo en Ciudad de Guatemala dictó sentencia en contra del ex jefe de Estado, Efraín Ríos Montt, indicando que él era culpable del delito de genocidio y de crímenes de lesa humanidad.
On May 10th, 2013, the tribunal passed sentence on General Ríos Montt, finding him guilty of the crime of genocide against the Ixil Maya people.
A los pocos días esta sentencia fue anulada, a los 10 días esta sentencia fue anulada por razones que son realmente incomprensibles, que voy a intentar de resumir. La defensa realmente no se dedicó a construir un caso sólido, más bien se dedicó al desprestigio de las víctimas, de las organizaciones de derechos humanos y de los funcionarios que habíamos acompañado el proceso. Y su estrategia fue que en el momento en que iniciaba el proceso, apareció un nuevo defensor que le dijo al tribunal: yo soy enemigo de dos de ustedes y amigo del tercero, entonces ustedes tienen que inhibirse, no pueden seguir conociendo. El tribunal, por supuesto, le dijo: usted no tiene razón, el que se tiene que ir de aquí es usted, y esa fue la base que utilizó la Corte de Constitucionalidad para anular el proceso. Y en Guatemala, como en muchos países del mundo, la Corte de Constitucionalidad es un tribunal extraordinario. Tendría que conocer cuando se habían agotado todas las otras instancias. Sin embargo, la Corte, con una prisa inmensa, ingresó directamente en el debate y anuló el proceso.
Unfortunately, several days after this sentence against General Ríos Montt was pronounced, it was annulled by the Constitutional Court, which argued that the trial had violated the rights of the defense. This argument is not sustainable for various reasons. One is that the military defense lawyers spent most of their time trying to throw into disrepute the victims or to indulging in delaying tactics. They started the trial by declaring that they were enemies of two members of the tribunal, and the tribunal actually replied that if this is not about who is enemies or friends, and the person who should withdraw in that case is you, not the tribunal. And this was the correct judgment. However, the Constitutional Court, as in many countries, has an extraordinary is invoked only in extraordinary cases to intervene when other resources have failed, and in this case, it should not have been invoked. ¿Algo? Okay. Entonces, vamos a saltar. Okay, está bien.
Y llegado a este punto, el esfuerzo enorme de víctimas, de abogados, de fiscales, del tribunal, de quienes acompañaron desde la comunidad internacional el juicio, la sentencia y posterior anulación de la sentencia, la pregunta: ¿valió la pena? ¿Valió la pena toda esa lucha incansable de las víctimas, esa valentía de los jueces y los fiscales, esa solidaridad que se vivió durante todo el juicio?
After the annulment of the verdict, the question that is almost inevitable to ask is, was it worth it? Was it worth the effort of the victims, of the witnesses, of the lawyers, of the prosecutors, of the judges, of the human rights organizations, the women's organizations? Was this all worth it?
Una podríamos llamar herencia del juicio, es un enorme esfuerzo por negar la verdad, por evitar que la sociedad de Guatemala se confronte con que en el país hubo genocidio y hay una sentencia de un tribunal nacional que así lo dice.
One of the unfortunate consequences of the judgment was that there was an enormous effort on the behalf of establishment figures in the country to deny the facts of history and to deny the fact of genocide and of the serious violations of human rights that had occurred. And the Guatemalan society, but the trial did allow the genocide to be named genocide, even though there was a huge effort to deny this after the trial.
Quizás el intento más burdo de la negación fue un decreto emitido por el Congreso de Guatemala que decía: por decreto no hay genocidio. Así deberían de decir: por decreto no hay hambre en el país, por decreto no hay violencia. Pero en sí mismo esta norma era una afrenta al principio republicano de división de poderes, porque son hechos que están frente de un tribunal que esperan juicio y el Parlamento puede decir esto es delito o no, pero no puede decir este hecho ocurrió o no ocurrió, una persona es culpable o inocente.
The crudest action to revoke the consequences of the trial was when the Congress, which was dominated by the party to which the General Rios Montt belonged, brought in a law declaring that genocide had not occurred in the country. Now this obviously is ridiculous, because you cannot bring in a law and simply say that hunger does not exist or that violence does not exist, and in the same way you cannot change the facts of history by bringing in a law. In a republic system, in fact, the Parliament or the Congress does not have the right to comment on the laws. Laws, by definition, are investigated by crimes are investigated by the judicial branch, and it is up to the judicial branch to adjudicate whether these crimes have in fact occurred and what is their gravity.
Sin embargo, y paradójicamente, frente a estos esfuerzos, no se puede tapar el sol con un dedo. Hicieron una encuesta, preguntaron quiénes en Guatemala, como las encuestas que hacen previa a las elecciones, quiénes en Guatemala creían o no, quiénes tenían opinión sobre un genocidio, y casi un 80% tenían opinión, un poquito más de un 30% decían que no hubo genocidio, y casi un 47% afirmaban que sí hubo genocidio.
Paradoxically, one can see that the trial had a huge social impact, because in a survey, a bit like a pre-electoral survey that was taken after the trial, 80% of the population actually had an opinion as to whether or not there had been genocide, and actually probably prior to the trial most people wouldn't have had an opinion or wouldn't have wanted to express it. And 36% said that there had not been a genocide, and 47% said that there had been.
Otra consecuencia es que los funcionarios que intervenimos en el proceso sufrimos una enorme campaña de desprestigio. Prácticamente cada domingo abríamos la prensa y estaban colocados nuestros rostros y los rostros de otros miembros de nuestras familias. Se decía que éramos subversivos, que éramos guerrilleros, que esto no era justicia, que era venganza. La juez que presidía el tribunal que dictó la sentencia tuvo una condena totalmente injusta por parte del Colegio de Abogados.
Another consequence was that the legal officials who had been involved in organizing the trial and bringing the case to trial were attacked through a campaign designed to bring them into disrepute. They and their families were accused of being terrorists or scroungers, and in fact they were simply completing their legal and professional obligations.
Pero junto a todos estos actos de campaña negra y de criminalización, creo que la inmensa ganancia del proceso y la sentencia fue el fortalecimiento del Estado de Derecho en Guatemala. Se demostró que sí es posible juzgar a un ex jefe de Estado en tribunales nacionales con un caso muy fuerte, muy sólido, y fue posible porque hubo funcionarios honestos, fiscales, jueces, abogados, que no se amedrentaron en toda esta situación y cumplieron con sus obligaciones, y sobre todo fue posible por el inmenso esfuerzo y la valentía de las víctimas, que nunca renunciaron en su lucha por la justicia en Guatemala. Muchas gracias.
And I'll just provide the translation of the final, of Dr. Pasipas's final words in this talk, that the benefit of the trial was to strengthen civil society and to demonstrate in the country that it is actually possible to judge a former head of state, because Rios Montt was not just a general, he was also president for a year and a half, to judge a former head of state in national trials, in the national court system, rather than, say, at the International Court in The Hague, and that it is, if you build a solid and logically argued and well-supported case, and then you can do this. And in fact, the officials who prosecuted the case did not allow themselves to be intimidated, but did in fact continue to do their duties. And this, in combination with the fact that the victims and the victims' families never gave up on getting justice, allowed this case to be prosecuted.
Thank you very much, Claudia. With great pleasure, I now introduce to you Magali Rosa. The title of her presentation will be The True Consequences of Mining in Guatemala. Magali Rosa is a Guatemalan activist, self-taught environmentalist who has worked trying to stop the destruction of nature in Guatemala since 1983, founder of Fundación Defensores de la Naturaleza and Colectivo Madre Selva. She has struggled to convince government society of the utmost importance of preserving the natural heritage, especially in a country like Guatemala. Rosa worked directly to establish nature reserves and to defend protected areas against foreign and industrial interests. During the last 10 years, she has strongly questioned extractive industries in light of the scarce, if any, benefit that these leave to Guatemalan native communities, and the fact that these extractive industries demand the takeover of lands in a country where land tenure is astonishingly uneven and the cause of violent death to too many in the recent past, and that they are a way to development that may well kill alternatives like tourism and agroecological activities that are more attuned to the culture, needs, and way of life of the Maya people. She writes a column in Prensa Libre, almost solely on ecological issues, and has done this since 1996, from which she has participated personally in the national political debate surrounding ecological problems. In January 2008, she started Savia, School of Ecological Thought, to open a new space for debate in light of the actual threat of climate change and environmental disruption over a naturally vulnerable territory and an extremely vulnerable society. Welcome, Magali.
Good night. I too want to thank the University of Weld for inviting me. This is my first time in Canada ever. And I want to share some images with you for those who have not been in Guatemala. I'm not the photographer. These were provided by friends. And this is the first time that I'm going to see them in the order that they were put for me. I have to ask you to bear in mind when I speak, first of all, what Claudia just exposed, because this is like our reality. And I'm afraid that since Claudia left the country, the justice system is not the same as when she left. We're going downhill in that sense right now. And as I speak, I'm going to share a couple things that I do need you to bear in mind. See?
Mhm.
So the first one is the size of Guatemala. It's pretty obvious there. But the inhabitants, we have a very small territory and half of the population more or less than you have in that amount of land. And that has a lot to do, that has a very strong relationship with the way our environment is suffering. Guatemala is one of the most beautiful countries in the world. It's one of the mega diverse countries. We have over 1,000 species of trees only, of which a lot are in danger of extinction. I haven't even seen this in this order, so. I am pushing it. Yeah, I just wanted to share some of the beauty, so when I talk about how much we're losing, you have an idea. And the wealth of the country is not only the nature, but the people. 22 different ethnic Mayan groups, plus Garifuna, Xinca, and what we call mestizos, that are people like me that are mixed, weird mixtures. Well, Guatemala is still one of the world's food distributions centers, of which there are only 5 in the planet. But then there's the inequality, the exclusion. And when I talk about mining, bear in mind that the great majority of mining concessions occur in indigenous lands. So if there was 80% of the useful land is in the hands of maybe 5–10% of people. And right now we're seeing a lot more of this inequality because of mining, and more recently because of palm plantations, palm oil. Over 50% of Guatemalan children suffer from severe malnutrition, and I will come back to this when we talk about mining. And I had this picture put there because Guatemala was suffering from a loss of biodiversity according to the Central American history. You know, the pace was our pace. But since the signing of the peace accords were signed in 1996. In 1997, we had a mining law, of which the majority of the people were not aware. It was written by the lawyers of the mining companies. And we didn't hear about mining until 2004. I'm going to share with you some maps before I go into mining. This is what's left, and that was done in 2011, so we have less now. This is what is left of our forests. Less than 1/3 of the country is covered with natural forests now. This is our river system. We have abundant water, of which 97% is already contaminated. Over 70% of the water is used by the agroforestry industry and now by the mining sector. So around 3 or even less, 2% of the water is available for people. This is our protected area system. The dark patch patches are sugar cane plantations. This is oil. And this is the mining. I'm going to add the mining later, but just for you to see. Unfortunately, I don't have the map where the indigenous territories are mapped, but they coincide. I put this one there because a couple of years ago there was, this is iron mining in the Pacific Sands. This is the only mining concession that was brought down because in the Pacific coast is where the rich people have their homes for recreation. This is the only case where, and look how huge the concession was, and it was brought down by the interests of the rich people. Now this is we have this map to show how in a very small territory they want to do everything, and I don't have the map of hydroelectric projects. Those are extremely connected with mining because it is because of the requirement of the mining companies that there's the need for this development of so many hydroelectric projects. Now, I am supposing that you as Canadians have a very good idea of the environmental consequences of mining. I'm guessing you do. But if you put mining projects, and especially gold, more than 80% of the concessions that are being negotiated in Guatemala are for gold. Imagine what happens in a country where the justice system is weak, where our institutions don't work. And this picture is the Inco mine of nickel in El Estor, which is now being operated by a Russian company. Inco was doing pyrometallurgy, the Russians are doing hydrometallurgy. So the Lake Isabel is in grave danger. I am going to give you a little bit of background on how we discovered what mining was. Because during the period of, the Inco story was something that was isolated. Not everybody knew about mining. And in 2003, at the end, the Guatemalan newspapers started announcing that there was gold as if that was the greatest discovery. People didn't really know anything about modern mining. And especially, they didn't know how good our mining law is for the mining companies. I will try to give you some details so that you can understand the grave danger that mining is posing especially over indigenous groups. According to our law, 1% of the royalties is for the country. Now, even that sounded like a good idea because people never knew how much a country loses when it devotes its territory to mining. Now remember the size of Guatemala, please, and the amount of population. There is no way you can do mining in Guatemala without hurting people really badly. When it was announced that Goldcorp had discovered gold in San Marcos, in the western part of the country, really a lot of people were happy and they said, okay, this is going to bring development. But our environmental ministry, which was pretty recent, was not prepared at all to deal with mining. The people were not prepared to deal with mining. What the mining companies are doing is they're going directly to the mayors of the towns. And the first thing they do is they offer the mayor the possibility of having all this money at their disposal. That is the first, I think that's one of the worst things because the mayor immediately turns against the people. And this has happened in every community where mining is being either developed or trying to develop a mine. According to our law, a mining company presents an environmental impact assessment that is written in a language that people will not understand, not only because it's in Spanish, but because it's technically written. And the people have 20 days to go through the environmental impact assessment and make their challenges. According to a mining expert, he's a hydrogeologist, Robert Moran, and I think he's one of the only people that are trying to fight what mining is doing, at least in countries like Guatemala. He's worked in Honduras, in Argentina, in Peru, in Colombia, in Romania. He says some of the environmental impact assessments he's seen in Guatemala are the worst he's ever seen. Because they're not even written to be, they're not serious at all. I'm going to give you some figures specifically about the Marlin mine, Goldcorp owned, because it's the one that I have studied more profoundly, but they're all similar. The Marlin mine can use 250,000 liters of water per hour without paying a cent for that water. They built that tailings dam without even putting lining on it, saying that since Guatemala is only slightly, seismic. It's seismic. Well, then the dam is never going to rupture. I don't know if you know how seismic Guatemala is, but in the last year only, we have had a lot of tremors, especially in that region. If there is any leakage, we will never know, because we have no way of knowing. And the environmental ministry that was it was new, has been totally corrupted. Absolutely corrupted. The environmental ministry, when some years ago we had a pretty good minister, they could not even go inside the mine property to test the waters. So if the leakage starts, we're never gonna know, ever. There have been studies done by outside universities that have proven that there is already problems. Arsenic is rising, mercury is rising, but the government has never stopped, even though the Inter-American Commission ordered the mine to stop at a certain point. They said you have to stop and you have to conduct studies. They did not stop because they knew already that the leaders of the Sipacapa resistance had been already corrupted. And they went to the commission and they said, we're dropping our case. That's the power of gold. These are just to show the changes that have happened since 2005, when they started working actually in the mine. Now, I want you to imagine the shock for the people of Sipacapa of seeing these trucks, these immense trucks, and having to live daily with the dynamite and the change in their lives. For me, one of the worst things is that these communities have been divided forever. There's now unrest and violence among the people. I'm still not talking about the other violence that the government is putting over the people, but the violence that's, if in one family, one kid gets a mining job, but the rest of the family are not in agreement. We have seen families that are fighting over mining. So when it was clear that the government and the private sector were behind mining, people started doing popular consultas, that's what they're called. And there were 65 consultation processes in Guatemala. The Constitutional Court has said that these processes are not binding, but they keep doing them. And I think they are giving these consultation processes legitimacy, because once in every process, all of them, it's been over 90% of the people that are against mining. Now this is in the communities that are going to be mined. In general, in Guatemala City, for example, where people are not so concerned about mining, over 65% of the people are against mining. One of the critiques of these consultations is that they were done by lifting their hands. When asked, why are you voting like that? Because the miners were saying, it's very unfair that they're doing this like that, because then they will put pressure against the ones that did not vote. And the explanation given by the elders was, we live in a community where we know each other. And we stand by what we think. And if we want mining, we have to let the people know we want mining. Why do you vote secretly? Are you ashamed of what you stand for? I thought that was really cool. But there's critique too that children can vote, and they said, well, the future belongs to the children. And if we're making decisions for them, we're being unfair. And they need to understand, and they have the right to know if they prefer gold to nature. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the violence. Since the very beginning, this is a very old picture of the first violent incident. I think that this was 2004 or 2005, maybe. It's written somewhere there. But the Ministry of Mining and the private sector held the first international congress on mining, and they forgot to invite the communities that were going to be mined. So we had a parallel congress where we invited the communities from San Marcos that were going to be heard, and the communities from Izabal that knew that the nickel mining was coming back. And they were already very worried because they had lived close to a mine already. And that's where I think that a lot of people realized that there was no information about mining. We didn't know what modern mining was, but we didn't know that there were 380 mining concessions being negotiated. Not necessarily the permits were being given, but they were on the table. And the people that came to this symposium learned that their territories were under attack. And I clearly remember the indigenous mayor, a woman from Solola, who was there, and she said, unless we stand together, mining is going to roll over us. And it was her that when this was a cylinder that was being moved towards the Martin mine. But it was huge, and they had to disarm I don't know how to say, una pasarela. It's where people walk over the highway. So they were dismantling this bridge. And the people she started saying on the radio, the miners are coming and they're going to Sipacapa, but we need to stop them. The next day, there were over 1,000 combined police and military forces helping the cylinder. And this is an image that keeps repeating itself. It's the government, the army, the armed forces, the private sector, the powerful people in Guatemala against the people in villages that do not want their territories to be mined. And when I named my talk, The True Consequences of Mining, I think this is, apart from the environmental consequences and their irreversible destruction of the mountains, where the indigenous groups were forced, some of these groups were forced to live in these mountains because it was not the most productive lands, because there was rocks there. Now they're being forced to leave the rocks, and where are they going to go? This is what they say, you know. When people talk about mining and they start saying, you know, what if we change the 1% royalty and we give you 2 or 3%? Right now they're talking about 5% voluntary royalty. They say, you know, this is not about money. It doesn't make any sense to us that you come here saying you're going to pay for the damage you're making. Because Mother Earth does not deserve that we treat it this way. And we cannot do this to our children. This is the way that people were talking in Zipacapa when they were being told that the mine was going to start operating. And I think this is the way that the majority of indigenous people feel about mining. It's not about the money. This picture is from one of the most recent violent incidents that's happening 19 kilometers from the capital, in a place where there's very little indigenous population, because in the majority of cases you'll find that it's 90, 97, 80% of indigenous people. This is mainly mestizos and just like 10% of indigenous population. It's called La Puya. It's a very interesting case because there was no international group in the beginning. There was no environmental NGO. They live in one of the driest parts of the country, and the mining company came saying they were going to put a tomato plantation installed, and they bought some land. But someone heard about rumors that there was a mine being developed there. So people started getting together, and by the time the mine was going to start bringing in the machinery, a group decided to block the entrance of the mine. And they were able to keep the mining company for almost 2 years from beginning the construction. But they were going to lose their permit if they didn't start, so they were getting very, very upset. And they started pushing people and pushing people. And it's called La Resistencia Pacífica de la Puya. That's the name of their movement. And it's mainly women. And at a certain point, the mining company got the army and the police forces to come. And it was the women with Bibles and religious songs that they were able to stop the miners from entering. But that was only once. Right now, the miners, they kept pushing people, and I think it was this year in May that they tear gassed them, and they went through. The people are still at the entrance of the mine, trying to say, you're here, but you're not legitimate. But the works have begun. There's another, these are some more pictures of that case. There's another case that involves another Canadian mining company. It's called El Escobal. That mine has a lot of silver. It's got gold too. But there were violent incidents there too. And maybe Claudia knows more how the attorney, la Fiscalía de Medio Ambiente, there were violent incidents, and of course they were accusing the people from doing the violent work. And someone under her jurisdiction had this tape recording where the security official was saying, "Kill those motherfuckers." That's the words he used. And it was them that started the violence. The people were the ones that were being accused. I think there nobody died, but a lot of the people were captured, they were held in prison, women amongst them, and if it had not been for the Fiscalia, the case would have they would have been kept in prison. Right now the guy is under scrutiny. He was going to escape the country, and he was captured at the airport. Thanks to their efforts, I don't think that's ever going to happen again, unfortunately. So what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of violence happening because of mining, because mining has the support of the government, of the the Guatemalan mining sector, the industrial sector. They have even been able to turn the universities either blind or mute, but there's no university really helping people. And it is my personal opinion that, just like Claudia was saying, the Rios Montt trial is bringing a lot of memories back, and it is dividing Guatemala again. And mining is doing the same thing. Wherever there is a person questioning mining, that person is an enemy of the people that are for mining. And for mining, I have never seen a community that really wants mining. There are desperate communities that need these jobs. One of the ideas that was sold and heavily announced is that mining was going to bring a lot of jobs. Mining has brought some jobs, of course, but now that mining has established itself, and it is it's bringing revenue for the country that we don't know where it's going, and it's 1%. It's not contributing with not even 1% of the internal...
The gross domestic product, GDP. Yeah.
So it's a lot of myths have been heavily announced by the mining sector. They have a lot of power, they're very loud, they have divided Guatemala more deeply. There's a lot of accusations going and coming. But one thing that, especially for all the Canadians here, mining is making the name Canadian a bad word. And it is very unfair, because I don't think you people are aware of what the mining companies are doing, and your ambassadors do. You know, the ambassador, Lambert, which was not the actual ambassador, he was writing open ads in Guatemalan newspapers saying that, you know, mining is an opportunity, it will change everything like it did for Canada. And I wrote back saying, hey, give me a break. You cannot compare Canada with Guatemala. You know, the size of the country, the amount of the population, the strength of your institutions compared to the strength of our institutions, the law, our law. It's unfair to do that. But I am afraid that mining is a problem that is going to stay. Up to now, no mining process other than the sands in the Pacific coast, and those were Chinese interests as far as we could learn. Nothing has stopped a mining company, even if the great majority of the Guatemalan population doesn't want it, even if there are studies now proving that economically, which was the great excuse, it's a very bad idea, because the balance between losses and gains was never done. The losses were never taken into consideration. If you consider that we don't know that much about how metal poisoning can hurt people, the environmental impact assessments that were approved by our government never gave the composition of the rocks. That means we don't know what's leaking into the waters. We don't know if there are heavy metals if there's arsenic, if there's mercury, if there's uranium, because there's uranium in Guatemala. So we cannot assess properly. We don't have water maps that will allow us to know if there's leakage in the dam, where is it going to go? So the weak system is allowing a lot of terrible things to happen. And I think it's getting worse because now we have, even if we are not talking about it, we have a military government. And there's military presence in every institution. The Protected Area Council, which at a time was an institution that was trying to do things to protect nature, is run by Benedicto Lucas' son. He's named Benedicto Lucas. And I'm not trying to say the guy is, well, I don't know if you're familiar with Benedicto Lucas here, but he was one, if Rios Monti is in trial, he should be too. He was he was the brother of Romeo Lucas, a dictator. So we don't have now a Council of Protected Areas, we don't have a Ministry of Environment, we have them in paper, and they get money from the government, but they're worse than useless. The justice system is falling apart again. I'm afraid right now we're undergoing some of the worst chapters. So environmentally, if this Mayan population that was so badly hurt by the internal conflict is the worst affected by not only mining, oil is coming back, oil palm plantations are taking the lands away from indigenous people too. So that's what I'm talking about, the true consequences of mining. I don't mean only mining, but I mean these things, apart from the environmental impacts, are going to have devastating consequences on the Guatemalan population, especially on those that are already very vulnerable. And I am not even going to go into what climate change could do in the same sense. Because if we start getting less water, these people are already being robbed of their water by the mining operations. And what are they going to do? And if it rains too much, then the dams can collapse. So I'm painting a very painful picture of a very beautiful country and of very special people. And after trying to work in the mining issue for over 10 years, I know that there is very little we can do inside, almost nothing. So we really desperately need some attention from outside, because inside Guatemala, the media, and I write a column every Friday in Prensa Libre, which is the most read newspaper, but whenever there is a mining incident, it will appear in page 48, this big. Unless someone's dead, then it will make headlines, and it will talk about these terrorist people that are opposing progress. So that's the reason why I accepted, after not traveling for 4 years abroad, this invitation, because I thought, okay, people from Canada should know that this issue is ruining Canada's very friendly name. And even in a community, if they see a foreigner and it's a Canadian, you could be in danger. And I'm not joking. I think that's one of the saddest things. And of course, internally, I think that apart from imagine half of the children under 5 years of age in Guatemala are extremely malnourished. If these guys are going to be in contact with contaminants, they're in worse shape than normal children. And I have been talking to toxicologists that say, I cannot say exactly at what point of danger there right now, but these pregnant women, malnourished themselves, that are exposed to drinking contaminated water. Children under 5 years of age that are drinking contaminated water, that are severely malnourished, are in very bad shape. If they are, we don't even know what type of contaminants they may be drinking. You know, we know that arsenic levels are rising and mercury levels are rising, and we cannot do very much yet because they're not over the line, but they are accumulating in these small malnourished bodies. This is the kind of reality that we are dealing with right now, and I don't see that we are being able to stop mining companies from operating. The other problem we face is that it is very difficult for us to get real information. There's a lot of confusion about how many permits are really being issued. The government says, oh, there's a moratorium, and we're going to study changes for the law. We're so afraid right now to touch the law because given the composition of our Congress, they may change it for the better of the mining companies at this point. I mean, we have the worst Congress in history. So if there's a change, it may be for the worse. So that's why I accepted coming here and talking to you Canadians, because I know Canadian people are so good, but your government is really misrepresenting you. And I think those are the true consequences of mining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magali. We're very grateful that you accepted our invitation. Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Kristen Wells, and the title of her talk is In the State's Own Hand, Reckoning with War Crimes Using Archival Evidence. Dr. Kirsten Weld is an assistant professor of Latin American history at Harvard University. She is the author of the book Paper Cadavers, The Archives of Dictatorship in Guatemala, as well as numerous articles and book chapters on Guatemalan history, the politics of archives and memory, U.S.-Latin American relations, and the Latin American Cold War. She received her PhD at Yale University in 2010 and taught for 2 years as the Florence Levy K Fellow in Latin American History at Brandeis University before joining the faculty at Harvard. For the 2014-2015 academic year, she is on sabbatical as a Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies. Welcome, Kirsten.
Hi, everyone. Let me say before I start that I'm grateful to be here for a lot of reasons, but I am really, truly humbled and honored to be sitting up here with my colleagues whose lifelong work in social justice in Guatemala in a variety of avenues has been truly transformative, and so it's really just a tremendous honor to be here, and I'm grateful to the University of Guelph for inviting me. Wait, I don't have slides. Are they coming? Okay. Perfect, that is the second slide. Okay, so we'll start there. We often hear the phrase legacies of dictatorship. And if we unpack that phrase, we quite easily start to see that legacies of dictatorship come in all kinds of different forms. Some of those are not visible to the naked eye, such as memories or psychological traumas, dreams, nightmares that can last for decades. Others are visible, but they're visible in their absence. They're visible in negative space. And so those might include topics of conversation that are still not discussed openly, people who themselves have been disappeared, geographic or architectural spaces that were once used in the service of state terror or repression that have since been repurposed or reclaimed, or mass grave sites, and there are lots of other examples I could think of. Other legacies of dictatorship are institutional in character, so we can think of laws or constitutions implemented during military rule, judicial processes, truth commissions, and other legacies still are economic and environmental, as we've heard just now. But there's another very literal take on the phrase legacies of dictatorship, and that is to refer to the actual physical stuff that a dictatorship, really any government, but a dictatorship in this case, will leave behind. And one of the most important kinds of physical stuff that dictatorships almost always leave behind is archives. Their documents, their files. And those of us who are historians, like me, have a certain normative assumption that any kind of archive is automatically and inherently important and worth preserving because that's, what we use to reconstruct the past. But I think that the archives of recent dictatorships have a heightened importance, one that goes beyond that regular historical imperative, and that's because those kinds of archives can offer answers to more immediately pressing questions. Questions like, where was this desaparecido buried, or which official ordered the killing of this student activist. So the archives of recent dictatorships can offer questions and answers that pertain to justice and the here and now, and that's why it's so important to look for them, to force citizen access to them, and to preserve them. So today I'm going to be speaking about the impact of these recently discovered Guatemalan police archives, which represent a tremendous fount of archival evidence that have made a tremendous impact in the Guatemalan political sphere. And so I'm going to center that conversation around the archives of the now defunct Guatemalan National Police. And to look at the role that state documents have played in efforts to break through the structures of impunity that you've already heard about this evening. I'll argue that the value of the files of past repressive regimes depends almost entirely on what is done with those files. So basically, the reappearance of a past regime's records basically doesn't inherently have any particular implications or impact or transformative power. Rather, what matters in terms of archival access is the extent to which that access is organized around, leveraged as a tool by social movements and civil society groups who are making demands and truth claims on the state, in this case demands for post-conflict justice. And what's so remarkable about the Guatemalan case is that this is exactly what happened when these police archives were discovered in 2005, and I'll explain more about how that happened in a second. But that in Guatemala, justice activists really took ownership of the issue of archival access and used it as a sort of language of justice. And in so doing, we're able to make some really lasting achievements. Again, in a broader context that is really quite sobering and difficult, but nevertheless, I think it's important to celebrate this really remarkable case study of an example of where Guatemalan activists have really been able to leave something behind, an achievement behind that can actually never be taken away. And I think it's important to recognize the rare occasions when that is able to happen, and also to point out that those kinds of victories or achievements are not easy, they're not foregone conclusions, and the challenges that are involved at every step of the way speak both to the incredible potential of archival evidence as a tool for social justice, but also to the limitations of archival evidence when it comes to a society trying to reckon with past war crimes. So let me just start out really quickly with some background. As you know, and as we've heard, representatives of the URNG guerrilla forces and the Guatemalan military signed peace accords, bringing Guatemala's long conflict to an end in 1996. And that conflict passed through successive phases over the course of its 36 years that was very different looking, depending on what year you were sort of peering into this conflict from above. That included successive waves of urban and rural mass mobilizations. It also included modalities of state terror that ranged from surgical political assassinations to indiscriminate mass murder, and of course during the early 1980s, a state-sponsored genocide against the Mayan population in the countryside. Guatemala's so-called transition to democracy also proceeded in a series of stages, and it really began with the 1985 elections that replaced overt, obvious military rule with an elected civilian leadership, but in a way that was very much managed by military high command in order that it remain firmly in control of the state behind a veneer of elected civilian leadership. So this had serious implications for the forms of institutionality that would outlast the war, and some of these were archival in nature or had implications for access to archives. For example, the peace accords created a truth commission, as you know. In theory, that truth commission was actually supposed to have had access to any and all state records, including the records of state security forces that it deemed necessary to carrying out its investigation into human rights violations from the war years. But when the commissioners approached the civilian government, which was then headed by the current mayor of Guatemala City, Alvaro Arzu, who was a former member of a very hardline right-wing political party called the Movement for National Liberation during the Civil War years. And so when the commissioners approached him and his government and attempted to actually reclaim their supposed on-paper theoretical access to records from the Defense Ministry, the Interior Ministry, which was responsible for the police, and other arms of the repressive state apparatus, they were just stonewalled outright. The government said, those documents, they've been burned, they've been lost, we don't have them, or we can't turn them over to you because it would be a violation of national security. So the commissioners had no choice but to base their report on other kinds of evidence, the kinds of evidence that were available to them, namely eyewitness testimonies, forensic evidence from exhumations, and some declassified documents from the United States. And their report concluded that state or paramilitary forces had been responsible for something on the order of 93% of the human rights violations committed during the years of the war. But because the commission had not had access to state records, that sort of opened up a way for conservative sectors in the country to claim that basically this report was not based on documentary evidence, and therefore it was all a bunch of allegations. Without documentary proof in the state's own hand, the commission was basically more or less making it up. This was the argument. And the fact that state forces had been the ones to deny that necessary documentation to the commission only made these arguments more infuriating and more outrageous. So there's that in the late 1990s. Fast forward a little bit less than a decade later, and Guatemala seems stuck. It's sort of their mid-2000s. There had not been a single prosecution of any war-era police or military official. The provisions of the peace agreement had been only unevenly, half-heartedly implemented. And even though you had an abundance of evidence about wartime atrocities, especially forensic and testimonial evidence, but also some documents, including an important file known as the Diario Militar that had been smuggled out of the Army's archives and published in the late 1990s, you still had almost nothing in the way of official recognition that much of anything had even happened during this war, besides the patriotic pacification of a few evil subversives by, this honorable military government. So it was quite a surprise, therefore, when investigators from the country's Human Rights Ombudsman's office, looking for something else entirely on a dilapidated corner of this sprawling police base on the outskirts of Guatemala City, stumbled upon the enormous archives of the defunct National Police. So this is the summer of 2005, and this really kind of lands like a sort of shot across the bow of the kind of political status quo in Guatemala at that time. The police had been disbanded under the peace accords because it was decided that as an institution, its hands had been too bloodied during the counterinsurgency for it to continue existing as an institution in peacetime. And its archives, which had more or less been sitting there in a half-finished building ever since, consisted of an astonishing 80 million pages of very moldy, decomposing material and quite atrocious physical conditions, thoroughly infested with vermin of all sorts. And so it was a treasure. It was obviously something that was tremendously important, but it was rotting away, and it would require an enormous and unprecedented amount of labor and resources to be able to preserve and save, much less use. So as of 2005, an activist initiative called the Project for the Recovery of the National Police Historical Archives, which I just call the Project, springs up kind of out of nowhere and sort of builds this sui generis human rights archival activist initiative to save these archives with funding from friendly members of the international community. And so they basically set themselves to this arduous work of rescuing these decaying files and analyzing their contents. And one of their primary goals was to generate evidence to use in the prosecutions of war-era officials for crimes against humanity. So this project operates from the get-go from a position of political commitment. Its founding director is a former guerrilla commander from the EGP, the Guerrilla Army of the Poor. And over time, the project transcended these very improvisational, sort of, kind of insecure beginnings to become this now internationally recognized precedent-setting effort armed with over 100 staffers, state-of-the-art technology, and support from around the world. And that's allowed them to digitize about 15 million so far of the 80 million pages in that collection, which are now freely available on the internet. They're like triply backed up on remote sites outside the country. That's what I'm talking about when I say an achievement that can never be taken away. Those archives could get blown up tomorrow, and those 15 million pages would be saved for posterity, for any kind of future use to which Guatemalans decide to put them. And let me stress that the success of this initiative was really very hard to predict when the archives were first discovered. As one person who was involved in the effort said to me at the beginning, 10 years ago they would have killed all the people working in an initiative like this. And this time around, the brave activists who were involved in doing this recovery work are all still alive, but they've faced grave forms of backlash. At least 5 arson attempts against the documents involving Molotov cocktails, death threats, staff members being followed, and political pressure to bury the most incendiary revelations from the files. So these police archives, which cover the late 19th century all the way up until the peace accords period, up until the mid-1990s, constitute the largest collection of formerly secret state records to be discovered ever in the history of modern Latin America, as far as I'm aware. And so they also constitute a tremendous source of potential evidence about police and to some extent military activity during the years of the war. And that's why their reappearance and rescue was so politically important. So I want to just describe for you what some of the concrete results of this recovery work have been and the impact that it's been able to have on the Guatemalan political scene over the last almost 10 years. The number one impact, and the one that I think is probably the most interesting to those of you who've come out tonight, is the ability of the archive to provide evidence for war crimes prosecutions. So, beginning in 2010, really, evidence from the National Police Archives was used by the public prosecutors at the newly re-energized public ministry led by Claudia Paz to secure convictions in some very high-profile cases. And these included the case of Edgar Fernando Garcia, who was a young student and trade unionist and Communist Party member who was forcibly disappeared in 1984, never heard from again. Also the case of the 1981 disappearance of a young agronomist named Edgar Sáenz Calito, and then the case of the 1980 Spanish embassy fire, and that's ongoing. And this was an incident in which dozens of protesters who had traveled to the capital city and had occupied the Spanish embassy in Guatemala City to protest rural repression were barricaded into the building and prevented from leaving while the building was burned down. So because of the information from the police files, some very notorious characters from these years are now in jail. And that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. And some of those characters include the former police director Hector Bol de la Cruz and the infamous Pedro Garcia Redondo, the reviled former head of the police's detective corps and its Commando 6 death squad. So I wanted to use the case of Fernando Garcia to give you a sense of what the process, I keep jumping ahead with the slides, to give you a sense of what the process of using evidence from the police archives in a court case actually looks like, because it's not as simple as you might think. You can't really just pull a smoking gun document out of the archives that says, I, General so-and-so, order the killing of student activist such and such, and then hand it over to the courtroom and, case closed and the person goes to jail. In fact, there are very, very few of what we might think of as smoking gun records in the police archives. Often in the documents, victims are not referred to using their legal names. They're referred to generically as subversives or we detained 2 terrorists today or 2 subversives, and you have to kind of triangulate to figure out, to the extent that you can, who they're actually talking about. So there's this whole bureaucratic language of terror and denial that makes the documents themselves sometimes not literally on the page say what they actually mean. So that renders the task of investigating using them a little bit more complicated. And so instead of having smoking guns, investigators have to triangulate between information from a bunch of different sources, as many different sources as possible, to even interpret the documents that they pull out of the archives. And in this case, what was really interesting is the document that sort of ended up being the key to the whole thing was a document that didn't, on the face of it, seem particularly important. But I'll explain to you what ended up happening. Basically, when Fernando Garcia was kidnapped, he had been walking with a friend of his, a fellow member of the PGT named Danilo Chinchilla, and they were kidnapped together in the same operation. But because of the way that it went down, shots were fired, Chinchilla was wounded, and so the 2 of them were taken away in separate vehicles. And Chinchilla was taken to the hospital because he'd been wounded. And from the hospital, with the assistance of some of his comrades from the PGT, he was actually able to escape. And so during once he had escaped, he actually recorded an audio tape testimony laying down all of the details of the kidnapping, everything that he had witnessed, the time of day, the street corner they were on, how many people, plainclothes officers seemed to be involved, what the car that took Fernando Garcia away looked like. Chinchilla himself a few months later was disappeared, kidnapped again, and he did not survive that kidnapping. But so what this meant, because he was able to leave this testimony of the disappearance, and often these forced disappearances were these sort of invisible events, right, taking place, executed by plainclothes officers, quickly hustling someone into the back of a van with no license plates. And so there weren't often direct witnesses to these incidents, but in this case you had this witness, you had this recorded testimony, and so that meant that investigators knew the precise time and place of Fernando Garcia's disappearance. They also found records in the police archives that showed a pattern of surveillance, that Fernando Garcia had been under surveillance by the police for, in fact, several years leading up to the operation in which he was captured. They had also been spying on the trade union that he was a member of, and there were files that attested to the complexity of the operation in which he was captured. So you could prove that there was intent on the part of the police as an institution to carry out an operation against this individual. But the most important document was this seemingly banal daily police report in which it was indicated that the person who'd written the report was recommending for police agents, low-level rank-and-file agents, for medals of commendation. And they were being recommended for medals of commendation because of their role in participating in an operation on the 18th of February, 1984, in Zone 11 of Guatemala City, in which it was written in the report they seized propaganda and firearms from 2 subversives. Didn't have the names of the 2 subversives, but because of the date and the location and the time of day, the investigators were able to deduce that the 2 subversives in question were indeed Fernando Garcia and Danilo Chinchilla. Now, the better part of this document is that because these agents were being recommended for a medal for having executed this crime against humanity, the agents were named in the document. So that document gives you the material authors of the forced disappearance. And so they were the first ones to be prosecuted. Next in line were the intellectual authors of the operation, and so that included the chief of the unit, the 4th Corps of the National Police, to which these agents had belonged, a fellow by the name of Jorge Alberto Gomez. And then above him, the individual, the military general who had been the chief of police at the time, and this is Hector Bol de la Cruz, who I mentioned earlier. And so those people are all now in jail. So the archives have provided crucial evidence to support courtroom prosecutions, both within the domestic Guatemalan system as well as in the inter-American system, where several cases using records from these archives are ongoing. And so the link here between archives and justice and the successful mobilization of these archives through a painstaking labor of investigation over many, many years is crystal clear. The archives have had other really interesting ripple effects, and I think in the interests of time, I'm going to just describe those in a very concise fashion. But a couple of them are also have interesting implications if we want to think about social justice moving into the future in Guatemala, despite the challenges. One is capacity building. So when the archives were discovered, there were fewer than 10 trained archivists in all of Guatemala and no fit institution, including the National Archives system, with a capacity to take custody of, let alone process and clean up, 80 million rotting pages of stuff. But now you have over 200 people. That's roughly the number of people who've worked for this project at one point or another over the last 9 years, who've been trained in modern archival methods, who understand the political importance of archives at a whole, for a whole range of activities involving social justice. And that means that if and when other collections of records become available in the future, say, for example, the archives of the military, which are not accessible despite many, many years of protest and social movement organizing to try to open them. But if that ever happens, it means that the country will have the technical capacity to actually deal with those records. And that's really, really important, because like I said, if you don't have the capacity and the will to deal with the records, well, then they might as well keep on moldering in their warehouse. They can't be made profitable use of. Another interesting impact has been resource sharing. So basically, because international donors have, comparatively speaking, poured so much money into the rescue of the archives, the police archives have this abundance of resources, trained staff, scanners, computers, ways of digitizing things. And they're committed to using that not only for their own project, but also for helping people rescue other potentially important bodies of records elsewhere in the country, and therefore generating more potential sources of evidence, right? And so that has included, for example, the 400,000 page archives of the organization of the government called the Secretaría de Bienestar Social, which oversaw international adoptions out of Guatemala from the 1970s through the late 1990s, so that's important, as well as the records of the bomberos voluntarios, the volunteer firefighters, who are traditionally the first people to arrive on the scene of any crime. They're the people who pick up the bodies. So their records are really important if you're trying to get to the bottom of human rights violations, forced disappearances, and political murders, especially in Guatemala City. So it's not just police documents being preserved, there are other documents too. They all represent sources of potential evidence and potential historical understanding. And then the last one that I'll highlight here is new collaborations and tools. The work of fighting for social justice in Guatemala has always been collaborative. It's always involved groups of organizations who have had to collaborate and work together because of the enormity of the odds that they're up against. And so you have to kind of come at these questions from a bunch of different angles. One interesting new collaboration is between the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala and the Police Archives Project to try to, this is going to be really hard, to try to match, using DNA analysis, some of the corpses whose burial was documented in the police archives as XX or unidentified, with some of the many human remains that are buried in the mass graves in La Verbena, which is the big public cemetery in Guatemala City. It's too soon to say how far they'll get, but this demonstrates one really important takeaway from all of this, which is that even 30 or 40 years after periods of historical violence, the tools at our disposal to understand and investigate that violence change. They aren't static. They can improve, right? New archives are found, new statistical instruments are developed, DNA science and technology evolves and becomes cheaper and more accessible. And so the trail doesn't necessarily grow cold. The horizon of what was possible for us to know 10 or 20 years ago has become that much wider. And so the types of justice that we might imagine to be possible have similarly expanded. Okay, so that sounds really rosy and optimistic. And this is always a difficult line to walk, right? Both celebrating the hard work and real achievements of justice activists while also acknowledging the enormous structural barriers remaining in place which prevent or oppose the kinds of systemic change that some of us in this room might like to see. So I wanted to throw a bit of cold water on the story here, just by way of conclusion, in case you were starting to feel good about the political situation in Guatemala. First of all, like I've implied, the utility of archival evidence, no matter how much of it you have, 80 million pages of it, in war crimes prosecutions or any other kind of prosecution is relational. It's dependent. It depends directly on the integrity and the functionality of the justice system. And as we know, in Guatemala, the integrity and the functionality of the justice system have been major sites of conflict in recent years. You can have all the damning evidence in the world, but if you've got corrupt judges, political pressure, overloaded dockets, and prosecutors under attack and being forced into exile, you're not going to get anywhere with that evidence, right? So we're talking about a kind of social ecology here that is necessary for archival evidence to really be brought to bear in a meaningful and lasting way. Second, as I alluded to, even the most precious kind of archival evidence for legal purposes, which is that's written in the state's own hand, government records, comes with all kinds of challenges, right? And in the Guatemalan case, these challenges have included the sort of almost Sisyphean labor of trying to get these disordered, decaying files into the kind of physical and organizational condition where they could even be consulted by investigators or by the public. And then finally, there's the fact that all this work is taking place under the pressure of a giant ticking clock as former military and police commanders age and die. On the one hand, the longer we wait, the more tools are available to justice activists. On the other hand, the longer we wait, the likelier it is that these people will not actually live to face justice. The most notorious police chief of the whole war, Germán Chupina, died peacefully in his bed a few years ago. One of the most notorious presidents, Oscar Mejia Victores, indicted by Dr. Paz y Paz's public ministry, was indicted, but the charges were suspended because of his age and ill health. He basically wheeled himself to the courtroom in a neck brace, and so that was that. So there are as many challenges as there are opportunities, if not more challenges. You can't draw a straight line from archival access to justice. You need inordinate amounts of hard work, tenacity, resources, creativity, people on the ground who are willing to assume a lot of personal risk, and a certain amount of stars aligning, right? There's a certain kind of serendipity factor that's hard to account for and replicate, but this is true of anything that's worth doing, right? This is true of any kind of serious confrontation with entrenched structures of power and privilege. And so what the Guatemalan case shows us is that even in the most difficult circumstances, hard work, tenacity, combined with new tools and tight-knit coalitions of social actors fighting for change can accomplish things that just a few years before would have seemed unthinkable. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to all of the panelists for 3 excellent presentations. I'd like to give each of you on the panel the opportunity now to add any comments or respond to each other if you choose to, if there's anything that you'd like to add or comment on. I'll open it up for the 3 of you first and then to the audience for questions. So just briefly, if there is anything.
Maybe what I would like to add is that there is a lot of links between the 3 presentations that maybe for people that don't know the country are not so easy to see. But if you add another map to the maps that Magali was showing, and it's the map of the massacres of the genocide, it coincides. And if you listen or read the names that were given to the students or to the trade unionists, subversivos, guerrilleros, terroristas, and you listen to the names that the prosecutors, the judges, the lawyers, the victims were called, are the same. And the people that resist against the mines are also called. So the enemies of the past, in a way, are seen as the enemies of the present, and the reaction of the state. We fortunately don't have as much violence as we have during the conflict, but there is violence, and there is not, the state does not protect his citizens as they should.
And I think I just would like to add that just like it happened during the violence, the things that are happening in rural Guatemala concerning mining and other issues like palm oil plantations and their resistance are not being told either. Just like what happened during the conflict, a lot of things were not known in the city, they were not being reported, and they're not being reported fairly now either.
Yeah, and the one last thing I'll say to another way of tying together these panels is that, or these presentations in this panel, is that in Guatemala, the language of transition, this notion that Guatemala has moved from war to some other thing that's not war, is a kind of teleological fiction that is one sort of politically convenient way of narrating a transition to a particularly naked and unbridled form of neoliberal capitalism, right? And I think that ultimately, all three of these stories are stories about capitalism, they're stories about economic elites and their allies in the military eliminating opposition to forms of economic activity that are profitable to them, which are not which are deeply unsustainable in a lot of different ways. And so I think that often we speak about justice and particularly criminal justice without actually talking about sort of the larger structures of capitalism and capitalist transition that in which those processes of justice or efforts at achieving justice exist. And so I think that that's one thing that we could think about together as well.
Thank you. Questions? Should I move the microphone into the audience, or we haven't planned this out? For just a few questions? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, we don't need all of these microphones.
No.
We can share one.
Okay, thanks, Lorena.
Here, like this.
Yeah.
Like right in your mouth. Yeah.
I was interested, Professor Weld, to hear your description of the necessary social ecosystem to aid the prosecution of these crimes using your methods. But maybe all three of you could comment on the position in the social ecosystem, the global ecosystem, kind of plays in supporting and abetting genocide in these countries through trade groups, through the support of the minorities, specifically, for example, through the support of the dictatorship in Honduras, in any other way, because that's something that we can be responsible for. Outline for us where our responsibility lies.
Do you need translation?
Well, as a Canadian, and you know, my sense of my own Canadianness has changed a good deal, by virtue of living outside Canada for the last 10 years, but really by virtue of spending so much time in Guatemala and being able to visibly see that when I first started traveling to Guatemala in 2001, literally, not only did I have a Canadian flag on my backpack, I knew Americans who would put Canadian flags on their backpack in order to, you know, get cred in rural communities. And the change when you travel around Guatemala is just so palpable in that regard. So, I mean, yes, I think that the responsibilities of, gosh, I mean, where do I even start? You know, the current government of Canada, the Harper administration, which has been around since I believe 2006, if my memory doesn't fail me, I haven't blocked it all out, is part of the problem. I don't think it's actually the entire problem, because I think that we, you know, those of us existing in Harper's Canada have tended to look back rather rosily on previous administrations, and that I think that a lot of the kinds of trade relationships that Canada has established with different countries in Latin America. No, I mean, Honduras is a much more recent example, but even if you look back at NAFTA, if you look at CAFTA and these other things, you know, this has been going on, and Canada's position has been shifting, or at the very least revealing its true self for a very long time, and back before 2006. So I mean, you know, what can I say? I think that there's a tremendous amount of really important activist work that is done in Canada by groups like Rights Action to support activists in Central America who are resisting mining, and there are lots of people here who can speak much more in a much more informed way about that than can I. I think that the current Canadian government really has got to go for that and other reasons. I think that I really can't speak to what's going on in Guelph, but I know that there are organizations here of engaged Canadians who are committed to fighting for their country to play a different role in the world. And you know, I have a very hard time saying what your responsibility should be, because I feel very guilty as a Canadian living in the United States at an institution that is sort of part of this whole larger apparatus and very actively engaged in promoting its continued interpenetration of Central America and elsewhere. So I think I will leave the question of the responsibilities of Canadians to my Guatemalan colleagues. No? Cop out, right? But
I don't think we can answer that.
yeah, I mean,
Honestly.
Bueno, ¿cómo están? Mi nombre es Miguel Marí, soy del programa de estudio latinoamericano de la Universidad de Weld y tengo 3 minutos para plantear una diapositivas.
No se entiende.
La primera es en el proceso de paz, cuando se vive el proceso de paz, en la ley transicional. Me gustaría saber usted qué piensa que se pudo haber cambiado, que se pudo haber hecho mejor. Esa sería la primera. Y la segunda, me gustaría saber un poco más sobre el proceso cuando la destituyen desde el cargo como la fiscal general, porque me parece muy claro que la habían destituido 7 meses, con solo 7 meses para terminar su periodo. Me gustaría saber por qué, o qué estaba pasando en esos 7 meses, por qué se apuraron tanto en sacarla del cargo, cuando solo le faltaban 7 meses para terminar nuevamente. Y la última sería relacionada con su futuro político, porque aparentemente pues, es muy popular en Guatemala y me interesaría saber qué piensa hacer para el futuro, considerando esa popularidad.
Anybody needs a translation for the questions? Yes? The first one, what could have been done better in the transition? Why was she forced to quit 7 months earlier than when she was supposed to? Well, that her term would finish, and her future in politics or what's about to happen.
If we examine the letters of the peace accords, I think that they were a good. They explicitly exclude amnesty for big human or gross human rights violations, for torture, genocide, forced disappearance. But it was the weakness of the justice system that never allowed before to these crimes to be brought to justice. Now they are saying again, maybe with what we what have been done. Lo que debería haber sido hecho.
what could have been done or should have
What
been
have
done.
been done is an amnesty, a total amnesty, and there is a rumor that it could be approved now by the Congress. So I think in the design of the peace accords they were good, but they never were fully implemented. Why did I end my term in May? I was named for 4 years, so I should end my term in December. But I think that some people were afraid that I continue. People that were linked with crime. People that were maybe afraid from justice. So the Constitutional Court ruled that I should leave my term in May because other periods that were constitutionally established, it was 4 years. So because the other periods before ended May, it should end. We never agree with that interpretation, but that was the interpretation that was given by the Constitutional Court. And my political future, no. I am in a university now.
Very political answer.
Yeah, bien hecho.
Good evening. Thank you very much all of our guest presentations tonight. My name is Alexander Pedersen. I'm a student at the University of Queens. I'm finishing up my PhD in geography, but I'm a proud University of Weld graduate from the International Studies program 6 years ago. But my current research for my doctorate is working with communities who resist Canadian mining companies. And I was fortunate enough to sit with the community of Lapuya for a few summers and to ask them what they would like Canadians to know about that particular project. And I've also had the privilege of being around the Marlin mine as well as Salvador, Natural Resources, and then some. So I would like to thank you, Magali, of course, for sharing the story with us. I'm sad to say that I don't think as many Canadians know about this as they should. I think you're speaking to a very socially and active group of Canadians. But I think that extends our job then to reach out and to meet your call, to tell other Canadians about what's going on in Guatemala, in Canada, the rest of the world. As a result of our own studies from PDAC, the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, we've discovered that over 34% of violations that are done internationally by mining companies are in fact Canadian, and that outweighs all of the other companies in the world. From that, we're all investors, and so whether we think we're related to this or not, just because we're Canadians, we are in fact intrinsically linked and have overlapping geographies with these particular companies. We invest in our RSPs, we pay our taxes, we support, through our taxes, governments that make decisions that have taken away humanitarian aid and replaced it with economic development aid through our Canadian companies. And so with that, I challenge all of us today to hear these voices in front of us who have traveled such a long way and to welcome you again to Canada. And that we can all have our say in this and that we can all petition and act on these voices that we've heard tonight and be a part of the struggle. So thank you very much.
Primero agradecerles a ustedes dos por estar acá. Siempre que viene de Guatemala nos da las noticias, siempre nos motiva y siempre pensar hacia el futuro. Después de tantos años casi siempre recibimos las malas noticias, las peores noticias, porque Guatemala nunca para de tener noticias increíbles. Como guatemalteco, igual mi familia, quiero agradecer a la doctora Paz por lo que hicieron, por tener el valor de llegar hasta donde pudieron en la justicia de Guatemala. Por tantos años la verdad de nuestro país ha sido negada. Por tantos años la justicia de nuestro país ha sido negada. Y ustedes tuvieron, usted y su equipo de trabajo, el esfuerzo increíble por lograr que llegara aquí una parte de justicia para nuestro pueblo. Eso para mí cuesta mucho tener las palabras para agradecerlo. Por muchos años nosotros hemos trabajado en la solidaridad de nuestro país y siempre vimos la frustración de no encontrar la respuesta a todas esas injusticias. Lo que ustedes han hecho es abrir un espacio, esa ventana oscura de la historia de nuestro país. Y eso no es fácil. Se tiene que sentir muy orgulloso de lo que han hecho. Te recuerdo a Gilberta Menchú cuando hicimos el milagro en 1993, después que le dieron el número de paz. Ella dijo una frase: yo vine acá a contarle que en Guatemala sucedió un crimen. Ahora ustedes saben que sucedió ese crimen. Y el que sabe que sucedió un crimen y no hace algo para resolverlo, se lo cómplice. Gracias por traernos esta información, gracias por compartir con todos nosotros lo que sucedió, que está sucediendo en Guatemala. Pero sí, tenemos fe hacia el futuro, y eso es lo importante. Sabemos que nos negaron la verdad, sabemos que nos negaron la justicia, pero verdad, tarde o temprano, sí valió la pena la necesidad, sí valió la pena. Gracias, infinitamente. Te agradezco.
It was not a question. But I would say really that I stand you deeply, Dr. Paz, because of her work. And she asked before in her talk, was it really worth all this struggle, all this effort to get something done? And the answer for me, and I hope for most of the people in Guatemala, is yes. Because it's tiny, but it's a window. It's a window that is open and it's open for everyone. He said more, but it's
Well, the recipe is that just the festival for many years, too, has been denied by the Guatemalan people, and especially justice. And now, there is one step. Small single step. But sooner or later, Guatemala is going to have justice for all the atrocities what we have suffered for many years. And as mentioned, one time ago in Rosa in 1993, she said that when she came to the University of Toronto, well, I have some news that I want to share with you. Those are crimes that happened in the country. And now that I share with you, now we know that a crime happened in the country. So, if people know that a crime happened in the country, they do nothing to help the servant, they become accomplices. And I just got my biggest gratitude to the Spirit Ambassadors and the team for all the efforts they did to achieve justice in Guatemala. And it's a hope for us. Sooner or later, we're going to have justice for everybody in Guatemala. I am sure that Canada is going to be part of it, because the solidarity of Canada has been very important for many different aspects. Thank you.
I know we have our head full of information at the moment, and we have the broadband in hand. I wonder if it has one.
I'm going to be brief, and I'm going to be Spanish and English. Me gustaría preguntarle cómo fue posible un proceso tan difícil, tan duro, con tanta gente detrás, pero para ti no de tan poco tiempo. Ya que, por ejemplo, en España, después de 70 años, todavía no se pudo juzgar al dictador, y el juez que quiso juzgarlo, que también les apoyó a ustedes, estaba condenado. I would like to review the question about how come in so relatively short time these crimes were deaths, as in comparison with Spain, where 70 years after the crimes of Franco, these haven't been prosecuted, and the judge that intended to follow them, which was also involved in the Mayan genocide as well in Guatemala, he has been prosecuted and he has been expulsed from his career. that is my question. And thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
I think that these are efforts that are adding through years. This is a large process. First the victims, then the forensic evidence, then the documents, then new authorities in the judicial system. So maybe for years we didn't have the hope that this was going really to happen in Guatemala. But the people continue claiming for justice and continue working for justice. And one day there was a new Supreme Court, a new prosecutor, and the cases went.
I will speak English. I am from Guatemala, living here in Weld. Excuse me. I had to leave Guatemala for the same reasons that these ladies are here. So I want to thank them for doing what they're doing. They're doing a fantastic job. Again, with my countrymen here, I thank you. My question is more direct. I think I know the answer, but I think that most people should know the answer as well. And that's the price that people like yourselves, and there are many the price that people like yourselves are paying for doing what you do. Can you please share with the rest of the audience here, because it's important that everyone knows that there's a war going on. It's a war against impunity. It's a war for justice, and it's going on. And people choose to fight it or not. And some of us, some do, some of us don't. So it's important to know. Thank you.
¿No tú? No.
Voy a contestar en español. No es sencillo. Durante todos estos años hubo una campaña de desprestigio en contra nuestra, en contra de los miembros del tribunal, en contra de las organizaciones, en contra de las víctimas. Pero yo creo que son cosas que se deben hacer y no puede uno detenerse a pensar qué va a ocurrir, sino actuar con la convicción de que tiene que ocurrir para que exista un cambio realmente profundo en el país.
Dr. Paz said that these are simply things that have to be done in order to affect a transformation in the country, and that one of us really had a choice to just have to do. But it was very hard at the beginning, and there have been constant smear campaigns against her and every member of her team, and that's important to bear in mind too. These people are working constantly against these kinds of smear campaigns, and also the victims are often misrepresented or besmirched in various ways, and so it's not really worth finding out what happened to them.
I think I would like to add, it's a thing that I got from your answer, Dr. Paz, is that you have to be fearless and not think about what is going to happen. Just do it because you think it's right to do it.
Yo quiero agradecerles a la fiscal mayor de Guatemala porque no voy a salir del contexto de llevar a cabo la acción de judicial que comete violaciones de derechos humanos que en México, que soy mexicana, no hemos podido lograr. Pero también quiero agradecerle que en el aspecto femenino, Guatemala también es un ejemplo porque han podido llevar a cabo un juzgado especial para las mujeres, que también deberían de tenerlo aquí en Canadá con respecto otro aplauso también, cosa que agradezco porque es una situación que estamos sufriendo con una pandemia, que lo dijimos en la entrevista, y muchas gracias, y obviamente está en lo correcto, eres parte de la historia y qué bueno que seas mujer.
That's not really, it would be more appropriate for somebody else to translate this. But, she said that she especially appreciates the aspects of the trial that involved having a separate consideration for crimes against women, and that as a Mexican she's aware this has not been able to be done in Mexico and it has been done in Guatemala. And she ended by saying, thank God we're a woman.
She's part of this process. She's
And she said we should have those kind of courts here in Canada too.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, thank you, Lisa.
One last question from here, then we'll say goodbye.
Complacida de encontrarnos, quisiera preguntarles qué está pasando con las mujeres que dieron su testimonio, qué está pasando con las mujeres que han sido apresadas por los conflictos internos. Si pudiéramos también compartir qué está pasando justo ahora con una serie de mujeres en Guatemala que encima de tener ese marco que se ha logrado en Guatemala, justicia es difícil para las mujeres.
Tu primero y así es la
There's a big question about the women now. What happened to the women that testified? What happened to the women that stopped the tanks? They've been incarcerated. And what's happening now?
For them to go back to their communities, I think that it was very important after being part of this high historic process and trial. And I think that they continue working and they are waiting for the next trial, maybe in January, but we are not sure that it will be done. It is, maybe it will happen or not.
I think there is something really special happening in Guatemala with women. The majority of important people doing important things are women. And in mining, it's not a different story. There's women that have been severely punished for resisting mining in Zipacapa, in San Miguel Ixtahuacan. The people, well, the most visible faces leading La Resistencia Pacífica de La Puya are women. One of them is being accused because there were shots fired in one incident, and so the miners that were left without a job are accusing the people from the Resistencia for damaging them. They're charging them with 90,000 quetzales or 3 years of prison, one woman among them. In El Escobal, there is a 16-year-old girl dead because of leading the resistance, but it's a lot. I think that the women are carrying the best or the most dangerous part of the resistance, and there is a phenomena of women doing the most important things right now in Guatemala. I don't know why that is. It's either because all the leaders were killed, a lot of men were forced to flee the country. I don't know, but it's true. It's her and Jasmine Barrios and a lot of very visible and very brave women.
So we're going to say goodbye, but good night. Thank you very much for coming to our friends of Toronto. Thank you. Well, it's not so far, and I'm glad that you could make it. And we have tomorrow the screening Gold Fever, sorry. It was, I feel the rush, but it's Gold Fever. And Magali, Rosa, and Rosa will be there to discuss a little bit about it. and continue this conversation. Any comments? You write to the address there and we'll receive them and we'll improve and we'll keep doing this kind of events for our community. Thank you very much.